I remember the cold before anything else. The thin, metallic chill of the hospital air brushing across my skin as if it were trying to wake me before anyone else did, but my body would not respond. I was floating somewhere between sleep and something heavier, darker. The voices around me sounded muffled, like they were speaking through a wall of water. One of them whispered, "She is crashing again." Another said, "Her vitals are unstable," but both voices drifted away, as if they belonged to another person entirely. I tried to lift my hand, but it felt anchored to the bed. The last clear memory I had was stumbling across the barracks hallway 2 hours earlier, trying to steady myself against the metal railing while my heart pounded out of rhythm and a strange burning sensation spread across my chest. I had pushed through 2 weeks of tremors, headaches, and hormone spikes, telling myself it was stress from back-to-back field rotations, but when my knees buckled beside my bunk and the world tilted into darkness, I knew something was wrong, something deeper, something that did not belong to me. The first voice that cut through the haze belonged to Major Sutton, the senior physician on call at Womack Army Medical Center. His tone was sharp, controlled, but I felt the tension behind it like a wire pulled tight. "Give me the lab panel now," he said. Then silence. Then a sudden gasp. "What on earth is this?" Another voice, a younger nurse, hesitated. "Major, are you okay?" Something heavy pressed against my chest. I could not see them yet, but I sensed the shift in the room, the kind of shift soldiers know all too well. The moment a leader realizes what they are facing is much worse than expected. Major Sutton exhaled slowly, then said in a low, steady voice, "Call CID, now, and seal this room." The words sliced through the fog in my head. CID, not a medical consult, not an internal note, not a follow-up appointment. CID, Criminal Investigation Division. The division you call when something is not an accident, not a misdiagnosis, not a random event. The division you call when there is a deliberate hand behind the damage. My pulse spiked. I tried to open my eyes, but my vision blurred into streaks of white and silver. Someone adjusted my oxygen mask. Someone else tapped at a monitor whose alarm kept rising. Then I heard Major Sutton again speaking on the phone, this time with an urgency that made the air feel even colder. "I need CID here before she wakes up. This is not a medical incident. This is tampering." My breath caught in my throat. Tampering. With what? With me. My mind clawed for clarity, but the fog kept dragging me under. I heard footsteps leaving the room, fast, purposeful. I heard the quiet click of a door locking. I heard the nurse mutter, "I have never seen him this shaken." The room faded again for a long moment, or maybe only seconds, I could not tell. When I finally forced my eyes open fully, the lights above me sharpened into focus in a sterile white glow. My head felt heavy, but the world was clearer now, and I realized I was no longer alone with medical staff. 2 figures in dark uniforms stood at the door, silent, alert, watching everything. The patch on their shoulders confirmed what I had heard earlier. CID. They were here for me. One of them glanced at me the instant he noticed movement, his expression professional, but marked with something like concern mixed with suspicion. "Sergeant Lane, can you hear us?" My throat tightened. I nodded faintly. He stepped closer, not touching anything in the room, as if even the air itself had become evidence. He studied me for a moment, then exchanged a look with his partner, a look that told me what they found in my body was serious enough to escalate before I could even open my eyes. My voice cracked as I tried to speak, but he raised a hand, gently signaling that I did not need to force words yet. "We are here to protect you," he said slowly, "but we need to determine what happened to you and how long it has been happening." The ground beneath me seemed to tilt again, but this time not from weakness, from realization. Something had been done to my body, not recently, not accidentally, not medically, and someone had known exactly what they were doing. The CID agent observed my reaction carefully, then said, "We are dealing with something that did not start tonight." I felt my heart pound against my ribs. A tremor shot through my hands. For the first time, dread rose in my chest, not because of the hospital, not because of the agents, but because a part of me already knew whose shadow was hidden behind all of this. I thought I had a health problem. I did not know my own body was about to expose a man who had controlled me for 20 years. I was born in Columbus, Georgia, a place people describe as warm, steady, and traditional, the kind of small southern city where everyone seems to know your family story before you can even speak it aloud. For most of my early childhood, that story felt simple. My father was a quiet mechanic who smelled faintly of motor oil and peppermint gum, and my mother worked part-time at a florist shop downtown, arranging soft colors into neat, beautiful shapes. We were not wealthy, but we were steady, and I remember believing that steadiness would last forever. That illusion ended when I turned 11. My father collapsed in the garage one summer afternoon and never came home. I remember the silence afterward more than anything else, a silence that stretched for months until my mother slowly began to search for company in places I did not understand. By the following spring, she remarried, and that was the first time I heard the name Earl Maddox spoken inside our house. He arrived with a smile that looked practiced, the polite, firm handshake of a man who wanted to appear dependable. He told my mother she deserved stability and told me I needed discipline and structure at my age. At first, I thought he was trying to help both of us, but something about his presence settled over our home like a shadow that never shifted no matter how bright the day was. He rearranged the furniture, claiming better airflow. He reorganized the pantry, claiming better nutrition. He changed the locks, claiming better safety. He monitored my homework, my weight, my schedule, my tone of voice, all under the umbrella of care. If I questioned why he was so involved, he would tilt his head and say, "I worry because you are fragile, Harper. You need guidance." It sounded generous when I was young. It grew more stifling with each passing year. By 14, I realized I was being shaped, not supported. Whenever I tried to push back, he used confusion as a weapon, twisting my words until I doubted my own thoughts. If I mentioned feeling uneasy around him, he would respond with concern, so sweet it felt sour. "You seem overwhelmed," he would say. "Maybe you need more structure." My mother rarely stepped into these moments. She seemed balanced on an emotional tightrope, too afraid to disagree with him and too attached to leave. Sometimes I caught her looking at me with something like guilt and something like fear, as if she knew something was wrong but felt unable to name it. As I grew older, the tension inside our house hardened into a quiet pattern of survival. I learned to stay small, stay agreeable, stay controlled. I became cautious with my feelings, avoiding anything that might trigger what he called corrective guidance. I counted the months until I could choose a life beyond that house. The day I turned 20, I walked into the Army recruitment office near Fort Benning. I had no grand patriotic speech in mind. I simply wanted a place where rules were written clearly and structure was earned, not imposed. I wanted distance. I wanted air. I remember the recruiter asking why I wanted to enlist. I answered with the first honest thought I had spoken in years: I need a fresh start. That decision became the turning point of my life. Training was tough, but it felt cleaner than anything I had ever known. Instructions were clear. Discipline came from effort, not control. Pain had purpose. For the first time, I felt ownership of my body and of the path ahead of me. By 23, I was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Support at Fort Liberty, North Carolina. I thrived in the rhythm of routine early runs equipment checks, field rotations. I liked knowing what each day demanded because it left no space for the confusion Earl used to twist around me. Still, there were small, unexplainable traces of the past that lingered beneath my skin. Even in the Army, I found myself cautious about letting people stand too close behind me or asking too many questions about my schedule. I told others I just liked privacy. But in truth, a faint echo of being monitored still lived somewhere in the back of my mind. I rarely spoke to my mother over the years, though she called occasionally with soft, awkward greetings and updates about things I did not ask to hear. She always mentioned how thoughtful Earl was, how much he wanted me to visit, how he worried that distance might make me lose my grounding. I learned to respond with neutral answers, just enough to keep the conversation from spiraling. Meanwhile, my body began whispering warnings I could not decipher. There were months when my hormone levels seemed strange, though doctors attributed it to stress from field training. There were nights when I felt sudden waves of fatigue, sharp and unprovoked. My sleep cycle drifted unpredictably, waking me at odd hours with a racing pulse. I would shake it off, drink water, and tell myself that soldiers dealt with far worse every day. The Army teaches you to push through discomfort, and I pushed harder than most. Still, each time I visited the base clinic, the diagnosis was the same: stress dehydration or exhaustion. Nothing serious, nothing alarming, nothing that explained why I sometimes felt as if my body belonged slightly less to me with each passing year. I convinced myself I was imagining it. After all, I had been conditioned for so long to second-guess my instincts that disbelief came easier than trust. Looking back now, those early warnings were not random at all. They were the first cracks in a truth I had buried for years, a truth that would not stay silent much longer, a truth that only surfaced fully on the night my body finally collapsed. The strange symptoms did not arrive all at once. They moved slowly like a shadow stretching across a room when the sun begins to set, so gradually that you do not notice the darkness building until it is too late to stop it. 6 months before the night I collapsed, I began waking at hours that made no sense, sometimes 2 in the morning, sometimes 3:50, sometimes right after I had finally drifted into sleep. My body felt keyed up, as if something inside me fired alarms my brain could not interpret. At first, I wrote it off as poor rest cycles from back-to-back training blocks. Everyone in my unit dealt with exhaustion. Everyone pushed through. It was part of the culture. But my sleepless nights grew more unpredictable, and soon they began pairing themselves with something else, a faint tremor in my hands that came without warning. During routine equipment checks, I sometimes struggled to fasten straps because my fingers refused to stay steady. I told myself it was caffeine, dehydration, fatigue, anything except a real problem. I was used to downplaying discomfort. Discipline meant not complaining. Or at least that was what I told myself. Other people noticed before I admitted anything was wrong. During a convoy prep in early spring, Corporal Jensen glanced at me and said, "Sarge, you okay? You spaced out for like a full minute." I snapped back so hard I startled myself. "Sorry," I said, just thinking through the checklist. He frowned slightly, not convinced, but polite enough not to push. Jensen was sharp. He noticed patterns others never saw. A week later, after a ruck march, he commented again, "You zone out a lot lately." "Everything good." I forced a laugh and blamed it on not sleeping well. He nodded, but I could tell he did not believe that was the whole story. Still, he let it go. Everyone on base carried their own quiet battles, and it was not unusual to keep them private. By the end of that month, the tremors had shifted from occasional to frequent, and I began losing focus in ways that made no sense. I would stand in formation and suddenly feel as if someone had pressed a dimmer switch inside my skull. My surroundings blurred for seconds at a time, leaving me blinking hard to force reality into clarity. I hated it. I hated feeling unreliable. I hated the idea that something might be wrong with me that I could not control. The Army had taught me to drive through physical discomfort, but this felt different, like my body was drifting away from me without asking my permission. When the medics checked me, they found nothing alarming. My vitals were steady, blood work clean. They asked if I had been under pressure recently. I laughed. We are always under pressure. One suggested mild PTSD symptoms from the last field cycle. I accepted that explanation because it was the easiest one to believe. I had carried emotional weight before. I knew how trauma could disguise itself as physical confusion. It made sense. Mostly. Still, there were moments when the unease in my stomach tightened in ways that felt strangely familiar. Familiar in a way I did not want to acknowledge. One evening in late summer, after a long day of equipment inspections, I returned to my room feeling an odd dryness in my throat. It felt as if I had swallowed something sharp and invisible. Minutes later, my pulse began racing in a pattern that reminded me of sprint intervals, but I had been sitting still the whole time. My chest tightened, and I had to grip the edge of my sink until the wave passed. I told myself again it was stress, heat, overexertion. There were so many easy explanations. It was simpler to choose one than confront the one possibility that lurked deeper in my mind. The next morning, I tried to brush off the episode until lunchtime, when I reached into my locker and found a small wrapped package labeled in my mother's handwriting, a care package. Inside were homemade snacks, a folded note, and a few supplement packets. The handwriting on the note was soft and familiar, but the neatness of the wrapping, the precise folds of the tape, the way everything was arranged into careful rows reminded me instantly of someone else. Someone who never sent anything without checking it 3 times. Someone who believed every detail mattered because every detail was a way to keep control. Earl Maddox. My heart tightened. My mother sometimes sent packages, but the organization of this one felt unmistakably like his touch. I stared at it longer than I should have, debating whether to eat anything from inside. It felt irrational to hesitate. Nothing in my life suggested I should fear food from my own household, but an instinct I could not name whispered pause. I ignored it. I told myself I was being dramatic. I ate one of the small baked bars while answering emails. Within minutes, the familiar burn returned to my throat even sharper than the night before. My heartbeat fluttered, then surged wildly. I grabbed the edge of my desk as my vision flickered. The room seemed to tilt. I waited for the wave to pass, tightening my jaw until the tremor eased. It eventually did, but something in me had changed. For the first time, I admitted silently to myself that this was not normal, that it had not been normal for months, that maybe it was not stress or PTSD or dehydration. Maybe it was something else, something intentional. Something connected to a man who had shaped the first 20 years of my life with such precision that the idea of him influencing my body now did not feel impossible. It felt disturbingly familiar. That afternoon, a message came from the visitor center, notifying me that someone had signed in the previous week during my duty hours. My stomach dropped when I saw the name. Earl Maddox. He had visited without telling me. He had walked onto my base into my world, a place I had built specifically to escape him. The staff member said he seemed disappointed I was unavailable. He left a small care package at the desk and asked that it be delivered safely. I thanked her, but the room felt smaller around me. I remembered his voice from years ago, always wrapped in false concern. "You need guidance, Harper. Your body is unpredictable. You need someone to help regulate it." I shoved the memory away, but it lingered long enough to leave a crack in my composure. That night, my symptoms intensified. My throat burned again, my heart pounded so hard I felt it in my ears, and my hands shook uncontrollably. I sat on my bunk, breathing slow and steady, trying not to panic. I told myself again that it was exhaustion or overwork or anything except the one truth clawing at the back of my mind. Something was wrong, and it was not random. I was beginning to suspect why, but I was not ready to face it. Not yet. The night I collapsed did not arrive with any warning beyond the lingering tremors that had followed me for weeks. I finished evening checks at the motor pool, returned to the barracks, and told myself I only needed sleep, real sleep, the kind that resets a soldier after a long rotation. By midnight, the building had settled into the quiet that comes after lights out. That soft, steady silence broken only by the hum of the ventilation system and the distant footsteps of the duty sergeant on rounds. I sat on the edge of my bunk, trying to steady the jitter beneath my skin. My throat still felt raw from the reaction earlier that day, and my pulse carried a strange, uneven rhythm I could not force into normal pace no matter how slow I breathed. I told myself to ride it out. I had pushed through worse in the field. At a little past 1, I stood to get water, and the moment my feet touched the floor, a wave of dizziness slammed into me so hard, the hallway pitched sideways. I reached for the wall, but my hand slipped, and instead of grabbing metal, I grabbed air. The last thing I remember was the cold tile rising to meet my cheek before everything went black. According to the report I later read, I was found at 1:32 a.m. by the duty sergeant who noticed my door slightly open. He called medics immediately. By 1:42 a.m., I was en route to Womack Army Medical Center, barely conscious, strapped to a stretcher under fluorescent lights that streaked across my vision like sharp white lines. My body shook despite the blanket covering me. Every breath felt thin. Every sound appeared distant, even though people were speaking directly over me. When they wheeled me into the emergency unit, Major Sutton was already there. He was known for being calm under pressure, the kind of medical officer who never raised his voice and never rushed unless absolutely necessary. But the moment he looked at my vitals, his stare sharpened into something colder. My pulse was erratic. My hormone levels were surging in ways that made no physiological sense. The staff moved quickly, attaching monitors, drawing blood, running a full panel. I drifted in and out, aware only of the rustle of gloves and the clipped tones of medical commands. Then I heard the sudden halt in Major Sutton's voice. He was staring at the hormone panel displayed on the overhead monitor, his brows pulled together, his jaw tightening. He leaned in closer, as if trying to confirm something that should not have been possible. "Run it again," he said. They did. The results matched. My body was showing patterns consistent with external interference, not dietary, not stress-induced, not medically normal. External. Something had been introduced into my system in a way that mimicked regulatory failure. I did not understand these details that night, but I felt the shift in the room. Experienced staff do not panic easily, but something in their movements changed from routine urgency to calculated alarm. The nurse beside him whispered, "Major, what are you seeing?" His voice stayed low but firm. Hormone disruption of this scale does not happen spontaneously, not like this, and not with a patient her age. As they prepared a second test, a lab tech returned with the first fluid analysis. He handed the tablet to Major Sutton, who scanned it once, then twice, as if the numbers might change if he blinked. His expression hardened. The room seemed to hold its breath. Synthetic irritant. The words dropped into the air like metal. It was a classification used only in rare situations, mostly in training briefings about domestic tampering cases where someone close to the victim had access to their environment or personal items. It was not something you expected to see in a military ER at 2 in the morning. Not in the bloodstream of a soldier with no history of medication issues. Not in someone who had no business being exposed to anything synthetic at all. He straightened, looked at the nurse, and said, "Seal this room. No one enters. No one leaves until chain of custody is established." The staff moved immediately, locking cabinets, securing samples, logging timestamps. A medic closed the blinds. Another secured the door. I felt the shift through the haze of half-consciousness, the way the atmosphere thickened, the way voices lowered in tense precision. I heard a phone being dialed. I heard Major Sutton speak in a tone that left no room for argument. "This is Major Sutton at Womack. I need CID activated now. Yes, now. We have probable tampering. Unknown duration, unknown source." Then, after a pause, "Bring them before she wakes up. It needs to be them." There was no confusion about what that meant. CID was not called unless someone believed a crime had been committed. Not an accident. Not an oversight. A deliberate act. Even half-sedated, my heart pounded so hard my ribs ached. My mind flickered through memories, earlier symptoms, the burning in my throat, the racing heart, the care package, the name on the visitor log. A quiet fear threaded itself through my chest. I could not speak, but the realization pressed against my ribs like a weight that wanted to break through. Someone had done something to me, not tonight, but over time. Someone who understood how to avoid detection. Someone who had been close enough to get into my life without setting off alarms until now. Voices around me blurred into a hum as my consciousness thinned. The last thing I felt before darkness pulled me under again was the presence of authority. A pair of footsteps heavier than the medic's boots stepping into the sealed ER as CID arrived to investigate the body I no longer fully trusted as mine. I did not hear them enter the room, but their presence settled into the space like a shift in air pressure. The kind that makes the walls feel closer and the lights feel sharper, even when your eyes are closed. CID agents walk differently from medical staff. Their steps measured careful alert, as if every movement might become evidence. Later, I would learn that agents Rowan Pierce and Miranda Cole arrived at Womack less than 20 minutes after Major Sutton's call, a response time reserved for cases the Army classified as urgent and potentially criminal. They spoke briefly with the medical team before sealing the doors behind them. The nurse on duty recounted the timeline, the collapse, the erratic vitals, the hormone panel, the synthetic irritant, the doctor's immediate concern. The agents listened without interruption. When the nurse finished, Agent Pierce asked a single question. Did she have any visitors recently? That was the moment everything shifted. The visitor center logs showed that someone had signed in the previous day during a window of time when I was working at the motor pool. Military bases do not allow anonymous entries. Every arrival is recorded with identification, time, and purpose. The name on the log was one I had spent a decade trying to distance myself from. Earl Maddox, my stepfather. He had come to the base. He had left a care package. He had not told me he was coming, and I had not agreed to see him. According to the clerk, he had seemed disappointed but polite, almost insistent that the package be delivered directly to me. He claimed it contained supportive items from home. That detail alone might not have raised suspicion, but in a case involving unexplained hormone disruption and a synthetic irritant, any physical object introduced into a soldier's living space became significant. Agent Cole examined the packaging still preserved in the evidence container. She noted the precise folds, the tight seams of tape, the uniformity of placement inside. She did not know Earl, but she recognized obsessive order when she saw it. The agents ordered all samples blood work and fluid analyses to be placed under strict chain of custody. One medic sealed the vials, another labeled them with timestamp and initials. Within half an hour, a courier was dispatched to transport the samples to Fort Gordon's Advanced Forensic Lab, which specialized in biochemical analysis for military investigations. The courier left under escort just after 3 in the morning. Meanwhile, Agents Pierce and Cole remained at Womack, standing near the foot of my bed as I drifted in and out of consciousness. I do not remember their first words to me because I was still submerged beneath the sedative burn of collapsing vitals, but I remember the feeling of eyes watching. Not in a threatening way, but in an analytical one, the kind of watchfulness that studies a battlefield before stepping into it. When I finally surfaced fully, it was nearly dawn. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above me, and my breath tasted like the inside of a plastic mask. I tried to sit up, but a wave of fatigue rolled through me like cold water dragging me back down. Someone moved into my line of sight. Agent Pierce. He looked mid-40s, composed and steady, the type of man who had learned long ago how to hide his reactions beneath professionalism. He spoke quietly. "Sergeant Lane, can you hear me?" I nodded slightly. My throat felt thick as if words had to fight their way through layers of fog. "Good," he said. "There are a few things we need to ask you." He did not introduce himself yet, which told me the situation was not routine. Routine requires courtesy. Emergencies require efficiency. Agent Cole stepped closer, a tablet in her hand, though she had not written anything yet. Her gaze was sharper, like someone who noticed details before the rest of the room realized they were important. Agent Pierce asked the first question slowly, deliberately, as if he were placing each word where I could not avoid it. "Has anyone tried to control your life?" The breath left my lungs in a stutter. I did not answer. He continued, "Has anyone ever monitored your health?" My heart thumped once hard, then again. My fingers twitched beneath the blanket. Still, I said nothing. Then the final question landed with a weight that felt like it cracked something inside my ribs. "Do you trust your stepfather?" A tremor shot up my arms, the kind I could not hide, even if I tried. My chest tightened, and I looked away, focusing on the heart monitor, as if the steady beep might anchor me. I wanted to answer no. I had wanted to answer no for years. But the word felt stuck behind a lifetime of being told to stay quiet, to stay agreeable, to not exaggerate, not accuse, not disrupt. The silence stretched. Agents trained to read people did not need verbal confirmation. They read reactions. They watched patterns. And mine told them far more than my words ever could. After several long seconds, Pierce exchanged a glance with Cole, a quiet nod between colleagues who had just reached the same conclusion. His voice softened, but carried no hesitation. "Sergeant," he said, "we believe we are dealing with long-term manipulation." The words hit me harder than any diagnosis. Long-term. Manipulation. They fit too well. They explained the tremors, the cycle swings, the exhaustion, the strange familiarity of the symptoms. They explained the package, the unannounced visit, the feeling I had ignored for months because it was easier than acknowledging the truth. My breath shook as I exhaled. Agent Cole finally spoke for the first time. Her tone, steady calm, almost gentle. "You are safe here, but we need the truth of what happened to your body. We will find it." Their assurance should have comforted me, but instead, my stomach twisted with dread because CID did not investigate possibilities. They investigated crimes, and I was starting to realize that someone I once trusted might have treated my body as something he could shape long after I left his house. My voice refused to come out, but inside, a single thought echoed like a siren growing louder with every passing second. This was not an accident. This had been happening for years. And now they knew it too. I used to believe the strange parts of my childhood were normal simply because they were all I had ever known. Memories blur when you grow up inside someone else's rules, and the person enforcing them convinces you those rules are not only reasonable, but necessary. Earl Maddox entered my life when I was 11, pretending to be a guardian, but shaping himself instead into a quiet force that reorganized every corner of our home until nothing felt like mine anymore. The earliest sign should have been the vitamins. At first, they seemed harmless small pills in neatly labeled containers lined up on the kitchen counter. He called them supplements, special blends to support growth and immunity. Your body went through trauma, he would say, referring to my father's death. Grief can weaken the system. You need a boost. I remember swallowing them obediently because my mother smiled faintly each time, and because Earl said it with such certainty that I felt foolish questioning him. Over the years, the bottles changed colors and sizes. Some had handwritten labels. He tracked each dose on a paper chart, taped to the inside of the pantry door, marking check marks beside my name as if I were a project he was completing. If I forgot a pill, he would appear beside me with a soft reminder. If I resisted, he would sigh like a man carrying a heavy burden and say, "Harper, I need you to trust me. You cannot regulate yourself. You need structure." That sentence burrowed into my mind so deeply that even now I can hear the tone he used, firm, patient, condescending. It made me doubt my instincts before I ever had a chance to form them. His control did not end at supplements. He restricted how far I could walk outside, insisting the neighborhood was unsafe. He monitored how much I slept, how fast I ran, whether my period arrived on time or late. He made spreadsheets, actual spreadsheets. He recorded my weight down to decimal points. He kept notes about my complexion and appetite and how often I seemed distracted in school. I thought he was being protective. My mother thought he was being thoughtful. Neither of us understood that care was only the cover for control. My mother gradually became someone I barely recognized. Before Earl, she was warm, if anxious, laughing easily and apologizing too often. After Earl, she folded into herself, orbiting around him the way small objects orbit a stronger gravitational pull. She deferred to his decisions even when they contradicted her own feelings. She explained his controlling habits as evidence of responsibility. "He is just cautious," she would whisper. "He worries about us. Don't upset him." Those words lodged inside me like instructions, and I followed them. Whenever I felt uneasy around him, I blamed myself. Whenever he corrected my posture or criticized my eating habits or commented on my breathing patterns, I told myself he meant well. That is how manipulation works. It disguises itself as protection. It twists fear into obedience and obedience into routine until the routine feels natural. It took me years to realize how unnatural my childhood had been. The night I finally decided to join the Army, I remember standing in the doorway with my duffel bag while Earl looked at me with a disappointment so heavy it felt like a hand pressing on my chest. "You are not ready for that kind of independence," he said. "You think freedom will fix you, but it will make everything worse. You will come running back." My mother cried softly behind him, asking me to rethink my decision, but something in me snapped into place that day. I wanted distance, I wanted breath, and I left without looking back. Training at Fort Benning felt like stepping into a different world. The first morning wake-up call startled me, but in a liberating way. Orders were clear. Boundaries had purpose. Instructors corrected mistakes without making me question my sanity. For the first time in my life, discipline felt empowering instead of suffocating. Yet some habits from home followed me like lingering shadows. I monitored myself obsessively, as if preemptively trying to avoid correction. I apologized too quickly. I hesitated before eating unfamiliar foods. And sometimes, when someone raised their voice even casually, I felt my stomach tighten the way it did when Earl was about to point out something I had done wrong. Despite all that the Army saved me, it gave me structure that belonged to everyone, not just to me. It gave me a rank, a role, a mission. It gave me an identity that did not revolve around being fragile. Earl did not accept my independence. He found new ways to maintain connection. At first, the packages he sent seemed benign snacks, puzzles, socks, messages from home. Then they grew more personal. Supplements again, powders in unmarked packets, protein bars wrapped too tightly. At the time, I thought he was trying to cling to old habits to stay involved in a life I had chosen to reclaim. I felt guilty for resenting them, so I accepted them. I used some of them. I never noticed anything harmful, or rather, I noticed things but never connected them. Occasional nausea, strange fatigue, sudden dips in mood, minor fluctuations I blamed on field training. Even when I felt uneasy opening packages he sent, I brushed it away. Soldiers are taught to identify threats clearly and logically. Threats are external enemies, visible dangers. I did not know how to categorize the threat of someone who said he loved me while tightening his grip on a life I no longer wanted him touching. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. His insistence on regulating my body, his obsession with measurement, his belief that I could not manage myself without him, even his tone when he spoke on the phone, a tone that carried disappointment wrapped in false affection. "Be careful," he would say. "You know how your system acts up. It is unstable without guidance." I never questioned how he knew details he should not have known. I thought it was coincidence, or intuition. The truth revealed by CID was far darker. Those so-called vitamins he engineered, the carefully sealed packages, the way my symptoms mirrored the subtle disruptions caused by long-term exposure to synthetic agents. All the small oddities that seemed unrelated to me formed a pattern that forensic investigators recognized instantly. A pattern of someone slowly tightening their influence over another person's body until the victim mistook interference for natural imbalance. CID saw it clearly, and once they laid out the timeline, the puzzle snapped together in a way that made my skin crawl. Everything I had chalked up to stress was something else entirely, something deliberate, something that started years before I ever put on a uniform, something that followed me long after I thought I had escaped. And now, I had no choice but to face it. The call from Fort Gordon arrived just after sunrise, though the light outside my hospital window still held the gray color of early morning uncertainty. I was awake, but exhausted, my mind drifting between fragmented memories and the steady beep of the heart monitor. Agents Pierce and Cole had stepped out briefly to speak with the medical staff, leaving me alone with the unsettling awareness that my body was no longer just mine, but evidence in an investigation I did not yet understand. When the agents returned, their posture had changed. They were composed, but there was a sharpened focus in their eyes, the kind soldiers and investigators adopt only when they have received information that shifts a case from concerning to critical. Agent Cole held a printed packet in her hand, sealed with the Fort Gordon emblem. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she took a seat near my bed, her expression steady but serious. "Harper," she said, the lab sent their preliminary analysis. "It is extensive." The knot already forming in my stomach tightened. I glanced at the folder, then at her, trying to read something in her features that might soften the blow, but nothing about her demeanor suggested the news would be mild. Agent Pierce stood near the foot of my bed, arms crossed in a posture of restrained tension. "The first test," he said, "matches what Major Sutton suspected. There is evidence of a synthetic irritant present in your system." My breath caught. I waited for him to explain something harmless, something coincidental. He did not. He continued, "The irritant was found in microdose amounts but consistently across several samples. The pattern indicates long-term exposure, not a single incident. Long-term." The words pressed against my ribs like weight. I swallowed hard. "That cannot be accidental," I said, my voice thin. Pierce nodded. "Not accidental. Not environmental. Not anything that would occur naturally or from routine diet or training conditions." My pulse quickened. I could hear it in the monitor's rising tempo. Agent Cole opened the folder and slid a page onto the tray beside me. I could not fully interpret the scientific terms, but I could see highlighted lines in yellow and red indicators of abnormal levels oscillating outside any healthy range. "The second compound," Cole said, "is more concerning. It is a hormone manipulation agent. It is not a commercial medication. Not something you could buy. Not something you would accidentally ingest." I stared at the words without speaking. My mind scrambled for explanations, anything other than the one forming slowly in the corners of my thoughts. An error, maybe. Or something contaminated from field training. Or a mix-up in the lab. But the agents had already ruled those out. Fort Gordon does not mislabel samples. Their standards were the tightest in the region. If the lab said the compounds were there, then they were there. And if they were there, someone had put them there. How long, I asked, almost whispering. We cannot confirm total duration yet, Cole answered, but the layered pattern in your samples suggests months at minimum, possibly longer. My throat tightened until breathing felt like pulling air through sand. My hands trembled beneath the blanket. If the exposure was long-term, then it could not have been recent. It could not have been accidental, and it could not have come from anyone who did not have direct access to something I consumed or handled. Pierce stepped closer, his tone steady but gentle. We asked Fort Gordon to analyze the delivery vectors. Their assessment is that the compounds would need to be introduced through consumable items or direct contact with personal products. That means someone with access to your food or supplements, Cole added, or anyone who provided you sealed items. My mind flashed to the care packages, the neatly wrapped bars, the supplement packets, the precise folds of tape, the name on the visitor log. My chest constricted. They must have seen the fear move across my face because Agent Pierce spoke with quiet clarity. Sergeant Lane, do you recall anyone outside your chain of command providing you items recently? I hesitated, then nodded. My stepfather visited the base. He left a package for me. Both agents exchanged a brief look, the kind investigators share when a theory solidifies into something tangible. Did you consume anything from that package? Cole asked. I swallowed. Yes. What I did not say was that something inside me had been afraid even then, but I ignored it because ignoring things was a skill I had perfected in Earl's house. Cole wrote something down, then closed the folder. Based on what we have the nature of the compounds, the duration, the access point, we are treating this as deliberate interference. This is no longer a medical anomaly. It is a criminal matter. She paused, letting the weight of that settle before adding, Officially, we are opening an investigation. Code name, Operation Iron Halo. The phrase sounded cold and precise, the way military operations always do, but this one felt disturbingly personal. It was built around my body, my history, my symptoms. Pierce continued. Operation Iron Halo will involve both CID and external labs. We will gather evidence, interview individuals connected to you, and examine every item linked to this case. And we will determine exactly how these substances entered your system. The room felt smaller with each word. Not because of their presence, but because the truth was closing in around me. Earl's instructions, his reminders, his obsession with my health, his insistence that I could not regulate myself. All the things I once dismissed as overprotective suddenly rearranged into a pattern that made sense in the most horrifying way. I pressed a hand to my forehead, trying to steady myself. "This cannot be real," I whispered. But it was, and CID already knew it. Agent Cole leaned slightly forward, speaking with the firm calm of someone who had walked victims through revelations far heavier than this. "You are not imagining any of this. Harper, your symptoms, your instincts, the discomfort you could not explain, they all point to a consistent cause. Someone manipulated your system over time. Someone close. Someone who believed they could shape your life without your awareness." I closed my eyes, unable to stop the trembling in my chest. The investigation had only just begun, but I already knew the truth they would eventually uncover. I had been running from it for years. Now my own body had spoken for me, and CID had heard it clearly. Operation Iron Halo was no longer an investigation into unknown tampering. It was an investigation into a man who had never stopped trying to control me. Operation Iron Halo escalated faster than I could process. While I remained under observation at Womack, CID moved outward in widening circles like ripples spreading across a lake after something heavy sinks beneath the surface. Agents Pierce and Cole were thorough, methodical, and disconcertingly quiet about the details they uncovered, but even from my hospital bed I could feel the investigation tightening around the truth I had avoided for most of my life. The first step was reviewing every physical item connected to me over the past several months. Packages, letters, supplements, anything not issued by the Army was treated as potential evidence. A team collected everything from my barracks room, placing each piece into its own sealed container to avoid cross-contamination. When they opened the care package Earl left for me, their expressions hardened. The outer tape bore clear signs of being peeled back and reapplied. The creases along the seams did not match the pressure lines of the original seal, and the adhesive showed faint residue from being handled multiple times. Inside, the snacks were wrapped with military precision, each edge folded sharply, each item placed in a layout too symmetrical to be casual. The supplements, meanwhile, were repackaged in small plastic sleeves with no manufacturer markings at all. CID did not need a lab to tell them this was suspicious, but they still sent the entire package to Fort Gordon for forensic testing, logging timestamps, and chain of custody with the care of people handling explosive material. In addition to the physical items, CID pulled the visitor center footage from the day Earl came to base. The camera above the counter captured his entry clearly. He stood stiffly at the desk, rocking slightly on his heels, glancing repeatedly toward the hallway where soldiers often passed. According to the clerk, he had asked twice whether I was available, phrasing his concern in ways that made it seem like he was responsible for my well-being. When confirmed that I was on duty and unable to come out, he smiled tightly, left the package, and moved aside, but he did not leave. The footage showed him waiting near the vending machines for nearly 20 minutes, glancing again and again toward the hallway, as if expecting me to appear. Eventually, he walked out of frame. That detail unsettled the agents more than the package itself. It suggested intent, persistence, and an emotional fixation that crossed boundaries most visitors understood instinctively. The next phase of the investigation sent CID directly to Georgia. Pierce and Cole traveled to Columbus to interview neighbors, former teachers, and anyone who had interacted with Earl during the years he raised me. What they found there painted a picture I had never fully seen from inside the house. Several neighbors described Earl as polite but overly controlling. One older woman, Mrs. Thompson, recalled how he had insisted on walking me to the bus stop even when I was in high school because, as he often said aloud where others could hear, Harper is fragile. She cannot regulate stress. Without me, she breaks. Another neighbor remembered witnessing arguments between my mother and Earl, although argument might have been the wrong word. It was more like Earl issuing calm, firm instructions and my mother shrinking beneath them. When the neighbor asked once if everything was all right, Earl replied simply, "She needs guidance. They both do." CID documented every comment. Back at my childhood home, the agents requested permission to inspect the garage, the place Earl had converted into what he called an organizational space shortly after marrying my mother. According to my childhood memories, it had always been off-limits. I never understood why. I used to assume it was where he fixed things, kept tools, or stored seasonal items. I never imagined what was actually inside. Beneath a stack of neatly labeled storage bins, CID found a notebook. At first glance, it looked like any other household ledger, but when they opened it, they discovered a system so detailed it made my hands shake when I later saw the scanned pages. Inside were handwritten entries spanning years. Each page contained columns with dates, observations, and notations, weight fluctuations, appetite changes, behavior patterns, sleep disturbances, stress reactions, and beneath many entries, a category that made my skin crawl: cycle irregularities. Some entries stretched back to my early teens. Others were recent, matching the months just before my collapse. CID agents read through them with growing disbelief. These were not parental notes. These were not casual reminders. These were data logs, personal data logs, logs that should never exist. One entry from 2 years ago read, "Harper shows signs of resistance, needs reinforcement of consistency." Another from 5 months ago noted hormone instability and a prediction that stress levels would spike without intervention. Some pages contained lists labeled supplement doses with amounts and schedules that eerily matched the patterns Fort Gordon had found in my bloodstream. CID sealed the notebook, immediately documenting every page. While still in Georgia, they interviewed individuals who had interacted with Earl at grocery stores, gyms, and repair shops. Many described him as obsessive with routines, a man who monitored physical health in ways that felt intrusive. One store clerk recalled him buying supplements by the bulk, always insisting on specific brands or powders even when told they were not medically necessary. Another described overhearing Earl say, "You cannot trust people to manage themselves. They need structure or they fall apart." When CID asked whether he ever mentioned me, the clerk nodded. "He talked about you often," she said. "He said you struggled with independence. He said he worried you would get sick without guidance." The agents brought these statements back to Fort Liberty, shaking their heads at the consistency. Every witness unknowingly repeated variations of the same theme, a story of control disguised as concern. When they returned to the hospital, Agents Pierce and Cole briefed the medical team in a private room. I was not present, but later heard parts of what was said. Between the lab findings, the tampered packaging, the obsessive notebook, and the comments from neighbors, the case had shifted from suspicious to deeply alarming. This was not merely interference. It was long-term conditioning. When they entered my hospital room afterward, silent for a moment before speaking, I could tell the investigation had crossed a line. Cole sat beside me, her expression firm. "Harper," she said, "we have enough evidence to confirm this pattern spans years. Not months. Years." My chest tightened. A heavy, cold dread moved through me. Pierce added, "Someone engineered access to what you consumed and monitored your reactions over time. This was deliberate, calculated, and deeply invasive." I could not speak. My hands trembled in my lap. They had not yet said Earl's name, but they did not have to. The evidence had already done that. Operation Iron Halo was no longer about identifying what happened. It was about stopping who had done it. The realization that the investigation was widening not outward toward unknown suspects, but backward into the darkest parts of my past left me shaking with something I had not felt since childhood. Fear mixed with a rising anger that simmered hot beneath my ribs. For the first time, I understood what CID already suspected. This was not a new crime. This was a long story finally breaking open. By the time the medical team allowed visitors into my room again, the sun had climbed high enough that its light softened against the blinds, turning everything into a muted haze. I felt hollow, as if parts of me were still scattered across the night I collapsed and had not yet returned. My body ached in strange rhythms. My mind ached in ways even deeper. I had not slept. I had not cried. I had simply existed in a suspended state, trying to understand how the life I built so carefully could unravel so quickly once the truth began to surface. Major Sutton entered quietly and pulled a chair beside my bed. He did not open a chart or look at the monitors. He simply studied me for a moment with the kind of steady attention that made it impossible to hide behind discipline or composure. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the clinical tone he used during emergencies. Instead, it held something softer, almost fatherly. "Harper, he said you were never weak. You were being controlled." The words hit me with a force I did not expect. Something inside me cracked wide open. I covered my face with both hands and tears slid down my cheeks before I could stop them. 10 years. 10 years since I last cried. I had trained myself not to break, not to show anything that could be misunderstood as fragility, because fragility had been weaponized against me for so long. But now, with one sentence, the facade collapsed. I felt the weight of memories I spent years burying rise to the surface like storm water breaking through a dam. Sutton did not interrupt. He waited patiently, letting me breathe through the pain that had lived in my chest since childhood. When my sobs finally softened, he placed a hand on the edge of the bed and said, "You need to hear this. None of this was your fault. The choices someone else made did not reflect your strength. They reflected their need for power." His words echoed pieces of truth I had never allowed myself to believe. Before I could respond, the door opened and Agents Pierce and Cole stepped inside. They paused, respectfully acknowledging the emotional shift in the room, then moved closer. Their expressions were serious but not cold. They sat across from me, giving me space but not distance. Cole spoke first. "Harper, we have reviewed everything from Fort Gordon. The compounds in your system did not appear once. They appeared repeatedly, carefully, in doses designed to avoid immediate detection." My stomach clenched. Pierce continued, We believe he has been conditioning you for years. Conditioning. The word felt heavy, clinical, cruel in its accuracy. It reshaped every memory I had tried to rationalize. The vitamins, the rules, the cycle monitoring, the care packages, the subtle comments from my mother, the sudden exhaustion I used to feel even as a teenager. Every detail that once seemed isolated now formed a clear thread connecting my past to my present. He has been shaping your physiology over time. Pierce added, his tone steady but carrying an undercurrent of anger on my behalf. Not enough to cause immediate alarm, but enough to create dependency. Enough to make your body feel unbalanced without him. A wave of nausea rolled through me as I imagined him tracking my reactions the way he tracked everything else. Recording symptoms, adjusting doses, observing changes, all while telling me I was fragile, that without structure I would fall apart, that he knew my body better than I did. I swallowed hard. Why would he do this? I whispered. The question broke something inside me, not because I wanted an answer, but because I already knew it. I lived under his version of concern for so long that I recognized the twisted logic behind it. Control was never about love. It was about ownership. Agent Cole met my eyes. Because people like him do not want you independent, Harper. They want you reliant, off balance, dependent on their judgment. They want to be the center of your stability so they can justify every boundary they cross. My pulse pounded against the base of my throat. Anger rose in me hot and fast, but tangled with it was fear, an old familiar fear I thought I had outgrown. I felt both emotions collide inside me until neither could fully form. I looked down at my hands. They trembled slightly. I hated that. I hated how even now my body responded as if he still dictated its limits. I am so tired of this, I said quietly. The words came out raw, messy, honest. Pierce nodded. I know, but you are not powerless here. You left once. Now you will take back everything else he tried to claim. Sutton stepped forward again, his voice steady as steel. You survived this. You made it out. And now your body is finally telling the truth. Let it. For the first time since collapsing, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, to feel the anger not as a threat, but as fuel, to acknowledge the fear without letting it define me. The truth was devastating, but it was also liberating. I had spent years believing I was unstable, broken, fragile, but now the reality was clear. I had not been weak. I had been interfered with, manipulated, conditioned, and I had endured despite it. CID would pursue the rest. My job now was to face what remained of the truth inside me and prepare for what came next. The moment CID expanded the investigation into Georgia, everything began moving at a speed I could barely keep up with. I remained at Womack under observation, but the updates came in fragments through Agent Cole's briefings. Each new detail felt like another layer of truth stripped off the past I had been trying not to see. But nothing prepared me for the message that arrived the following afternoon. Agent Pierce stepped into my room, his expression unreadable, but his shoulders tense. Harper, he said. Earl fled. For a second, the words didn't make sense. Fled from what? From whom? But then the reality hit me hard enough that I sat up straighter. They went to question him at your house. Pierce continued. The moment they identified themselves, he bolted out the back door and into the woods. Of course he did. Earl had always believed he could outmaneuver consequences. In his world, accountability was for other people. Rules were suggestions, and boundaries were things he enforced but never obeyed. Cole added, Georgia State Patrol is assisting. They've launched a coordinated grid search across the woods behind the property. My breath tightened. I knew those woods intimately. I grew up near them. I played there. I hid there when I was younger, trying to escape his constant oversight. Those woods were dense, twisting, impossible to navigate without familiarity. If Earl wanted to disappear for a while, he could, but CID wasn't a group he could outrun forever. As the hours passed, the search widened. Helicopters skimmed the tree line. K-9 units combed through thick underbrush. Officers moved in sweeping formations through miles of forest. I tried resting, but every noise outside my hospital door made my nerves jolt. Earl on the run meant unpredictability, and unpredictability from someone like him was dangerous in ways I still struggled to articulate. Around dusk, Cole re-entered my room. They located him. The relief that washed over me was so sharp it felt like pain. "Tell me everything." She sat down, clasping her hands. "Officers followed footprints about 3 miles in. They found him near a clearing. He was yelling, loud enough for them to hear before they saw him." I swallowed. What was he yelling? Cole hesitated, not out of uncertainty but out of concern for how I'd take it. He kept shouting, "She needs me. She can't regulate herself. Without me, she falls apart." My chest tightened violently. Hearing that through CID's voice was different than hearing it in my memories. It was not protective. It was not caring. It was a possession claim, a narrative he had repeated so often that even now he believed it with absolute conviction. Pierce added, "They ordered him to stop. He didn't. He kept yelling that he was the only one keeping you balanced. He claimed you would be lost without his guidance." I felt my stomach twist. Years of subtle conditioning collapsed into clarity. Those words were never about care. They were about ownership. And now he was screaming them into a forest while law enforcement closed in on him. "What happened next?" I asked. Cole continued. "Officers approached slowly, trying to de-escalate, but he backed himself against a tree, waving his arms, refusing to comply. When they stepped closer, he fell to his knees, shouting that you were unstable on your own, that he was the only one who understood your body." My hands trembled beneath the blanket. The delusion in his words wasn't new, but hearing them spoken in a moment of panic revealed something more frightening. He truly believed them, not as manipulation but as reality, as justification. Pierce finished. "They detained him safely. He's in custody now. No injuries to him or officers." My breath released slowly, as though my lungs had been held hostage for hours. The image formed in my mind uninvited Earl standing in the woods, disheveled, frantic, shouting my name as if he were the victim, as if he were the protector, as if he still believed he had any rightful place in my life. I asked softly, "Did he say anything else when they arrested him?" Cole nodded. He said, "She wouldn't have survived this long without me." That line cut deeper than anything else. Not just because of the arrogance behind it, but because for so many years I had believed some version of it. The officers transported him to the Muskogee County facility for holding. CID immediately placed a federal detainer. He wasn't going anywhere now. For the first time in weeks, my pulse steadied. The threat was no longer loose. The man who had shaped so much of my life without my consent was finally facing a system he could not manipulate. Still, a strange heaviness settled in me. Not sorrow, not guilt, but the weight of confronting reality without the buffer of denial. I whispered almost to myself, "He ran because he knew." Pierce shook his head. "No. He ran because he lost control. Men like him don't fear justice. They fear losing ownership." That truth settled deep inside me. Earl wasn't afraid of punishment. He was afraid of irrelevance. He was afraid of my independence, afraid of my clarity, afraid that after 30 years his narrative was finally collapsing, and now, arrested in the woods behind the house where he had built his illusion of authority, he had no power left to hide behind. As night fell outside my hospital window, I lay back against the pillow, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Safety. Not complete yet, not permanent, but real. The chase was over. But the reckoning had only just begun. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at the Muskogee County Courthouse, but by the time I arrived with Agents Pierce and Cole, it felt as though half the town had gathered outside. News vans lined the curbs, reporters clustered at the steps, photographers lingered near the entrance like vultures waiting for the first sign of movement. I had expected a quiet preliminary hearing, something procedural and contained. I should have known better. Cases involving military intervention always drew attention. Cases involving long-term manipulation and bodily interference drew even more. But cases involving a stepfather who fled into the woods, screaming that he alone controlled his adult daughter, those were gasoline on dry grass. As we stepped out of the CID vehicle, the crowd surged. Questions were shouted, cameras clicked in rapid bursts, but Pierce positioned himself between them and me, guiding me through the doors without saying a word. Inside, the courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old paper. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. People were already filling the benches neighbors I had known as a child. Old teachers, people who had nodded politely at church gatherings without ever seeing the truth of our home. And there was my mother sitting stiffly near the front, twisting a tissue in her hand until it shredded. She didn't turn when I entered. She just stared straight ahead as if the wooden bench beneath her were the only thing keeping her upright. I took a seat between the agents. My palms were damp, my throat dry. I had faced military evaluations, high-pressure jumps, and battlefield conditions more chaotic than anything civilian life could offer, but nothing compared to the tension of sitting in a courtroom where my past would be dissected in front of strangers. When Earl was finally escorted in the room, shifted. He looked smaller than I remembered, disheveled, pale, but his eyes still held the same self-assured certainty he had used to govern my childhood. He scanned the room until he found me, and he smiled the same tight smile he used whenever he believed he was in control of a situation. I felt my stomach turn. The judge entered and everyone rose. The proceedings began quickly. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Keller, stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, this hearing concerns allegations of long-term bodily interference perpetrated against Sergeant Harper Lane, a member of the United States Army. The evidence includes military laboratory findings, forensic analysis of consumables, and documented behavioral patterns consistent with coercive control. Murmurs swept through the gallery. Keller continued CID's involvement is unusual but warranted due to the nature of the substances found in Sergeant Lane's system. We will present those findings today. A woman approached the stand, the Fort Gordon toxicology specialist. She explained the compounds discovered in my blood, the synthetic irritant, the non-commercial hormone agent, the pattern of microdose exposure. These substances, she stated firmly, were introduced repeatedly over time. This was not accidental. This was intentional. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. She looked at me, then looked away quickly as if the truth were too bright to face. Earl shifted in his seat, shaking his head. The prosecutor continued by presenting the tampered care package. Photographs of the resealed tape were enlarged on monitors, the nutrient bars with inaccurate wrappers, the supplement packets with no manufacturer origin. Each piece of evidence felt like a bruise pressing deeper into old wounds. Then came the notebook. CID agent Cole carried it to the evidence stand as though it were radioactive. Keller opened it carefully and let the pages fall one by one. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Rows of handwriting, date columns, dosage notes, observations about my physical responses, notations about my sleep, my appetite, my cycle, my stress markers, my training periods, my emotional reactions. It was all there in blue ink, preserved with the chilling precision of someone who believed nothing about me existed outside his jurisdiction. This, Keller said, holding the notebook up for the judge, is the personal log of the defendant. It contains multi-year records documenting deliberate tracking and manipulation of the victim's physiological state. My chest tightened so sharply that I pressed my hand against it. Seeing it was one thing. Hearing it described out loud in public stripped away any remnants of denial I still carried. And then came the audio. CID had recovered several voice memos from Earl's garage computer. He had recorded himself analyzing my reactions like a scientist studying an unwilling subject. The first clip echoed through the courtroom with eerie clarity. Harper stabilizes when I control her intake. She becomes unpredictable when she tries to manage herself. She needs guidance. A chill rippled through the room. Another clip played. If she leaves, her body will lose structure. She will fall apart. She always has. My skin crawled. My mother covered her ears. And then the audio that shattered what remained of the courtroom's composure. She belongs under supervision. Without me, she is a danger to herself. A reporter in the gallery let out an audible gasp. Earl's attorney tried to object, but the judge overruled. Earl's calm facade finally cracked. He surged to his feet, face red, voice shaking with fury. "I kept her alive," he shouted. "She would be nothing without me." The courtroom erupted chaos, voices overlapping, cameras flashing. Reporters were already texting and tweeting. A spectator near the back yelled, "Sit down!" Someone else muttered, "My God!" CID agents moved instantly. Pierce stepped forward while deputies forced Earl back into his seat. But the damage was done. His outburst reverberated like a confession carved into stone. Every camera caught it. Every journalist recorded it. Every person in that courtroom saw the truth revealed in its purest, ugliest form. The judge pounded the gavel repeatedly, calling for order. "Mr. Maddox, you will restrain yourself or be removed from this hearing." Earl glared but fell silent, barely. When the room finally calmed, Keller concluded the presentation. "Your Honor, this hearing has shown clear evidence of coercive interference over many years. The victim did not imagine her symptoms. She did not exaggerate. She did not misunderstand. She survived." Those last words hit something deep inside me. Survived. Not endured. Not tolerated. Survived. When the judge adjourned for the day, people began rising from the benches, whispering, shaking their heads, stunned by the revelations they had witnessed. But for the first time in my life, the truth was not a private burden. It was public, documented, acknowledged, witnessed. The weight I had carried alone for decades no longer belonged solely to me. I stood slowly, gripping the railing for balance. My knees trembled, but my heart felt lighter than it had in years. As I walked toward the exit, a reporter's voice drifted from behind me. "That poor woman," another whispered. "I can't believe he did that to her." Their sympathy wasn't what freed me. It was the fact that they knew. They finally knew. Outside, cameras flashed again, but this time they weren't invasive. They weren't hunting scandal. They were recording justice unfolding in real time. For the first time, I felt air fill my lungs without restriction. The world knew what he'd done. The truth was no longer trapped inside me. And that more than anything was the beginning of my freedom. The trial began 3 months after the hearing, but the weight of it settled over me long before I ever stepped into the federal courtroom. Columbus felt different now, smaller, sharper, as though every street carried an echo of the truth that had finally surfaced after decades spent buried under Earl's carefully curated illusion of concern. Reporters still lingered outside the courthouse each morning, though the frenzy had quieted into an organized storm rather than a chaotic one. The public had shifted from disbelief to outrage, and outrage had settled into anticipation, the kind that follows a case where justice is no longer a question, but an expectation. When I entered the courtroom on the first day of trial, the gallery was already full. Veterans from Fort Benning, military spouses, advocates for survivors of coercive control. People who had never met me but felt connected to the case because it exposed something many feared, but never named the insidious nature of manipulation hidden beneath the mask of guardianship. My mother sat in the second row, hands clasped tightly as if she were trying to keep herself from unraveling. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, no expression other than hollow shock. Her shoulders sagged in a way I had never seen before. Earl was escorted in next. He no longer looked like the man who had raised me. His confidence was gone, replaced by a jittering restlessness that made him shift in his seat, tapping one foot on the tile floor. He looked around the room with a strange mix of indignation and desperation, as if waiting for someone to stand up and declare this entire trial a misunderstanding. But no one did. The prosecutor Ada Keller began with a statement that carried the weight of both the evidence and the moral undertone of the case. "Your Honor, this trial is not merely about illegal substances or tampered consumables. It is about long-term interference with bodily autonomy. It is about coercive control disguised as care. And it is about actions that directly affected the readiness of a United States soldier." At that last line, something tightened in Earl's jaw. He hated the mention of the military, hated the idea that the institution that had liberated me might also be the one to bury him legally. Keller presented the charges one by one: tampering with bodily integrity, poisoning, coercive control, military interference. Each count was read slowly, giving the courtroom time to absorb the gravity of what he had done. The defense attempted to argue that Earl's actions were driven by misguided concern that he had not intended harm, that he believed Harper suffered from undiagnosed medical conditions he was trying to stabilize. But the forensic evidence shredded those claims mercilessly. The toxicologist from Fort Gordon took the stand again, explaining how the synthetic agents were administered repeatedly in precisely consistent microdose intervals in ways that could not be accidental. "No one does this by mistake," she stated firmly. "This pattern indicates a deliberate attempt to alter the victim's physiology." CID agents presented the tampered packages, the photographic evidence of resealed tape, the documentation of items substituted or repackaged. Then came the notebook. The courtroom held its breath as Keller placed Earl's handwritten logs onto the evidence projector. Page after page illuminated the screen, detailed entries preserving my physical existence like lab data. One page tracked my heart rate over a series of weeks. Another recorded fluctuations in my mood. Another noted unstable period, likely due to environmental independence. A phrase that made my stomach twist. When the audio clips were played again, Earl's voice filled the courtroom, each sentence heavy with entitlement. "She stabilizes when I control her intake. She needs my structure. Without me, she breaks." My mother broke first. She crumpled in her seat, sobbing loudly enough that the judge called for a brief recess. She had spent years believing Earl's narrative, letting him shape her understanding of what I needed, what I was, who I could become. Now, the truth shattered in front of her, sharp enough to cut through the denial she had wrapped herself in for decades. When court resumed, Keller concluded the prosecution's argument with a quiet but devastating sentence. He did not protect her. He possessed her. The defense had no response strong enough to counter the overwhelming evidence. They attempted to argue diminished capacity over protectiveness, emotional instability, but each angle collapsed under the mountain of documented intent. When the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent. Guilty on all counts. Earl inhaled sharply, gripping the table as though the wood itself might anchor him. For a moment, his eyes darted around the room again, searching, pleading silently for someone to stand beside him in solidarity. No one did. Sentencing took place the following week. Judge Harmon, a stern man with decades of experience, delivered the ruling in a tone that left no space for interpretation. The actions of the defendant represent a profound violation of personal autonomy, bodily integrity, and military readiness. This court finds no mitigating circumstances adequate to reduce sentencing. He paused, letting the silence settle like dust. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 25 to 30 years in federal custody. A gasp rolled through the gallery. My mother covered her mouth again, sobbing harder than she had during the trial. She looked at me with shattered eyes, begging silently for comfort or forgiveness, or some acknowledgement that she was not the monster sitting beside her. But I could not give her that. Not now. Not after everything. I looked away. Earl was already speaking again, his voice cracking with desperation rather than triumph. "Harper!" he called out, twisting in his seat until the deputies restrained him. "You don't understand. I kept you alive. I kept you balanced. You needed me." The deputies dragged him toward the side door. He struggled, shouting louder. "You can't regulate yourself without me. You never could." His voice echoed down the hallway until the heavy steel door slammed shut behind him. And then it was quiet, utterly quiet. I exhaled slowly, a breath I didn't realize I had been holding for years. The judge dismissed the courtroom. People began rising, murmuring, wiping tears, whispering the word justice under their breath. My mother remained glued to her seat, trembling. When I walked past her, she reached out a hand but stopped halfway, fingers curling into her palm. I did not stop. I did not look down. I did not offer comfort. That part of my life was gone. As I stepped outside into the warm Georgia air, sunlight hit my face, and for the first time in decades, I felt truly present in my own body. The sentence didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the damage. But it reclaimed something far more important. It restored ownership. He no longer controlled my body, my choices, my narrative. Justice had spoken in a voice loud enough for the world to hear, and I walked into the sunlight, finally free. For a few weeks after the sentencing, the world felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful exactly, but unburdened, as though the constant invisible pressure I had lived under for decades had finally lifted. I slept through the night for the first time in years. I woke without the familiar tightness in my chest. Even my reflection in the mirror looked different, as if my face had been carrying weight I never noticed until it was gone. I thought that chapter of my life was finished. Then the letter arrived. It was delivered through official channels, a plain envelope stamped with the Federal Correctional Facility's insignia. CID intercepted it first, scanned it, cleared it, and handed it to me only after ensuring it contained no threats or contraband. Still, my hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. The handwriting inside was unmistakable. Earl's. Too neat. Too deliberate. The handwriting of a man who believed precision equaled righteousness. I forced myself to read the first few lines. Harper, I know you must be confused about everything that has happened. You misunderstood my intentions. You always did. I never meant harm. I only meant to guide you. You need guidance even now. I stopped. My jaw clenched so hard the muscles ached. Even here, even after trial conviction sentencing, he still spoke as though he were the authority in my life. The next lines were worse. I want you to come here so we can talk face to face. There are things you don't understand about yourself. Things I need to explain before it's too late. You owe me that much. My breath caught. Oh, him. The delusion was intact, complete, unbroken by reality or consequence. He still believed I was his to shape his, to direct, his to summon. The arrogance of it hit me like heat rushing up the back of my neck. I didn't finish the letter. I didn't need to. I folded it once, twice, then tore it straight down the middle, then again and again. I dropped the scraps into the nearest trash bin, wiped my hands on my jeans as if touching the paper had stained me, and walked away without looking back. That should have been the end of it, but narcissists rarely make a single attempt at reclaiming control. The next morning, my phone rang, my mother's number. My stomach tightened, but I answered. Her voice came through shaky, brittle, exhausted. Harper, she whispered. I spoke to Earl's attorney. He says Earl just wants closure. Maybe you should go see him, just once. For peace. For my peace. That last part struck harder than the rest. For her peace. Not mine. Not healing. Not accountability. Her comfort. Her ease. The old dynamic re-emerging like a bruise beneath the skin. I closed my eyes and inhaled slowly, letting the anger settle into something steadier. Mom. I said, my voice calm but edged with steel. I don't owe him anything. Not closure. Not conversation. Not a single breath. She cried softly into the phone. But maybe forgiveness would help you move on. I have moved on, I replied. That's why I'm not going. She hesitated. Harper, he gave you so much of his life. I almost laughed. A short, humorless exhale. No, I said. He took 20 years of mine. Silence. Heavy. Long. Then my voice settled into something cold, decisive, unshakable. I gave him 20 years. That's enough. My mother didn't argue after that. She just cried quietly, then hung up. I felt no guilt. None. For the first time, the boundary between us was clean, defined, and immovable. Over the next few days, more letters attempted to arrive. CID filtered them automatically. I never saw the contents. I never asked to. Pierce gave me a simple summary. He's trying to regain psychological ground. Cole added, men like him believe punishment doesn't apply if they can still reach your mind. They asked whether I wanted all future correspondence blocked. Yes, I answered. Immediately. Earl's attempts to reinsert himself into my life faded after that. He was locked away physically and now locked out mentally, emotionally, psychologically. I reclaimed the last space he once occupied, and the absence of his influence didn't feel empty. It felt clean, sharp, bright, like stepping into sunlight after decades in a dim room without realizing how dark it had become. For years, he believed I couldn't regulate myself, couldn't survive without him, couldn't define my own existence. And now, here I was, living freely, breathing easily, laughing again, rebuilding a life that had nothing to do with him, His audacity had returned, but for the first time it carried no weight. It landed on a version of me he no longer recognized, a version that refused to bend comply, or even entertain the idea that he still mattered. He was wrong about me. He always had been, and the truth he hated most was the truth that saved me. I didn't need him. I never had. Healing did not arrive as a single moment of clarity. It came in waves, subtle at first, then unmistakable, shaping my days with a quiet steadiness I had never known before. The medical team at Fort Liberty began by addressing the physical damage. Major Sutton referred me to an endocrinologist who specialized in long-term hormone disruption, and together they built a treatment plan designed to reset my system gradually without overwhelming it. For the first time, the medications I took were ones I understood, ones prescribed with transparency and consent rather than secrecy and control. Every appointment felt like reclaiming territory someone else had mapped without my permission. The first few weeks were difficult. My energy fluctuated wildly. Some mornings I woke feeling rested. Others I felt as if I hadn't slept at all. My emotions ran close to the surface raw in ways I wasn't used to. But midway through the second month, something shifted. My sleep pattern stabilized. My appetite came back. The constant tension that lived at the base of my skull began to fade. I could feel my body responding not to manipulation, but to care. Real care. Parallel to the medical recovery was the psychological one. Military behavioral health assigned me to a trauma-informed therapist named Dr. Evelyn Marks, a calm, steady woman with silver hair and a voice that could level mountains without raising its volume. She didn't flinch when I described the control, the conditioning, the years of internalized doubt. She understood the intersection of military discipline and personal trauma in a way that felt strangely comforting. "You built discipline out of necessity," she told me during our third session. "Now you get to build it from freedom." Some days in therapy felt like tearing old wounds open again. Other days felt like finally breathing without restriction. And slowly, the questions that once haunted me began to loosen their grip. Why didn't I see it sooner? Why did I believe him? Why didn't I fight back? The answers came gently. Because I was a child. Because coercion feels like care when you grow up inside it. Because survival sometimes looks like silence. After a few months, Dr. Mark suggested something that felt both terrifying and necessary: relocation. "You need a space that doesn't echo with old patterns," she said. "Somewhere you can define yourself without history whispering at the edges." Southern Pines, North Carolina offered exactly that. Quiet streets, longleaf pines stretching toward open sky. A community familiar with veterans but not saturated by base traffic. I found a small rental house with pale blue shutters and a wraparound porch. It wasn't far from Fort Liberty, but it felt like another world. The first night I slept there, the silence startled me. Not the heavy silence I grew up with, the watchful kind, but soft silence. Restful. Mine. Establishing routine became part of my healing. I woke early not from anxiety, but from the gentle rhythm of a repaired circadian clock. I made coffee on a porch that smelled of pine resin. I stood barefoot in the yard, watching morning light catch on the tips of the grass. Then I began moving again. Slowly at first. A walk around the block, then 2 blocks, then a mile. Running had always been part of my training, but running for myself instead of for performance felt different, lighter somehow. My breath no longer carried panic or doubt. It simply carried me. Yoga followed. At first, I struggled with stillness. Holding a pose meant listening to my body, and for years I had been trained to distrust its signals. But as weeks passed, I began recognizing the difference between discomfort that heals and discomfort that warns. I started trusting myself again, piece by piece. One afternoon at a coffee shop, I overheard a flyer being posted on a bulletin board. A local group for women veterans met every Thursday night. No agenda, no uniforms, just connection. I hesitated, but eventually went. The first meeting, I sat in the back, quiet, observing. The older veteran beside me introduced herself with a grin. "You're new," she said. "Don't worry, we don't bite. Mostly we just laugh at the stuff civilians don't get." By the third meeting, I was speaking freely. By the fifth, I was laughing harder than I had in years. There was something healing in being surrounded by women who understood discipline, pressure, trauma, and resilience without needing explanations. They didn't ask for details I wasn't ready to share. They simply made space. Over time, I found myself filling that space with parts of me I thought had been lost. I learned to cook meals based on taste rather than calorie tracking. I slept through thunderstorms without jolting awake. I threw away the remaining supplements I once relied on not because I feared them, but because I no longer needed anything tied to that old life. My therapist noticed the change before I did. "You're inhabiting your body now," she said during a session in early spring. Not monitoring it. Not bracing for impact. Living in it. I sat with those words for a long time. Inhabiting my body. It felt foreign and wonderful. Healing wasn't linear. There were days when memories tugged at me unexpectedly, when a medical form asking about long-term symptoms made my throat tighten, when a sudden noise brought back echoes of controlled caution, but each time I returned to myself faster. Each time the past felt further away. One morning, standing on my porch with warm sunlight on my face, I realized something profound. My body no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a home. And reclaiming it, the rhythms, the impulses, the strength, the quiet, was the greatest act of resistance I had ever made. I wasn't healed completely. Healing doesn't work that way, but I was healing fully, actively, consciously. And every step forward belonged only to me. I didn't plan to return to the house in Columbus. For months, even hearing the city's name made my stomach tighten in ways that reminded me how deeply the past could still reach for me if I wasn't careful. But healing has a strange rhythm. It brings you forward until eventually you find yourself standing at the edges of old wounds, not with fear, but with clarity. One morning in early summer, I woke with the distinct sense that it was time. Not for closure exactly, but for reclamation, the final step in taking back what had been taken from me for so long. I drove down familiar highways beneath a blue sky so bright it felt almost surreal. The trees thickened as I approached my old neighborhood, the long-leaf pines forming a canopy that filtered light into shifting patterns across the road. Nothing had changed, and everything had. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The paint on the shutters had faded slightly. The lawn was neat, but less manicured than when Earl used to obsess over its symmetry. My mother had moved into a small apartment after the trial. The house remained vacant, legally tied up as evidence in the civil proceedings, but I had been granted access to retrieve personal items. Standing at the front door, I hesitated for a moment. The key felt cold in my hand. I exhaled slowly, then unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air carried the faint scent of old carpet and dust. Sunlight slipped in through the blinds, illuminating motes that drifted lazily in the stillness. The silence of the house was different now, not oppressive, not controlling, just empty. Neutral. I walked through the living room, letting my fingers brush the back of the couch where I used to sit rigidly while Earl lectured about posture. Down the hallway where each creaking floorboard once signaled his approach. And finally to my old bedroom. The door stuck slightly as if resisting the memories sealed behind it. When it opened, I noticed immediately that the room felt untouched. The wallpaper was the same faded pattern. The bedspread still carried the pale colors my mother once insisted would keep me calm. My old dresser sat against the wall drawers half open from the earlier evidence search. But something tugged at me deeper than the visible remnants. A faint memory. A hidden corner. I knelt beside the bed and reached underneath, feeling along the wooden slats until my fingers brushed something thin and metallic. A latch. My breath caught. I tugged gently, and a small wooden box slid out from the shadows. It was the size of a shoebox worn smooth from years of handling, with a tiny brass clasp that clicked open far too easily. Inside lay the pieces of my childhood I had long tried to forget. A series of pill bottles labeled with dates, old notebooks tracking my weight, a thermometer, a small heart rate monitor, a stack of index cards with notes written in Earl's neat, precise handwriting. Unstable week. Increased supplement dosage. Emotional irregularity likely due to independence. My throat tightened. The air felt heavy, thick with the residue of years I hadn't realized were still holding on to me. At the bottom of the box beneath the charts and bottles was something smaller, a folded sheet of paper. I opened it with trembling fingers. It was a list titled Corrective Measures. The bullet points underneath made my skin crawl. Monitor intake. Reduce exposure to stressors, friends, school variability. Track emotional spikes. Reinforce dependence messaging. Reinforce. Dependence. Messaging. The words carved themselves into me, not because they were new, but because seeing them handwritten clarified something I had spent years trying to unravel. None of it had been accidental. None of it had been misguided care. It was deliberate, structured, intentional. With the box in my hands, I felt the weight of every lie collapse into dust. My body reacted before my mind caught up. I stood moved through the house and walked straight out the back door into the yard. The summer air was warm, thick with the scent of pine and grass. I hadn't stepped onto this lawn in years without feeling watched, but now the space felt open. Mine. I placed the box on the ground and retrieved a metal fire pit that leaned unused against the fence. I set it in the center of the yard. One by one, I emptied the contents of the box into it. Notebooks, pill bottles, charts, monitors, reminders, chains disguised as structure. My hands didn't shake anymore. They felt steady, purposeful. When everything was piled inside, I struck a match. The flame flickered, then steadied. I lowered it into the pit. At first, only a thin curl of smoke rose. Then the fire caught. The paper brightened, edges glowing orange, curling inward as the words that once dictated my life burned away. Bottles cracked, ink warped. The list labeled corrective measures vanished in a flash of white flame. I stepped back and watched as the fire consumed the symbols of the control that had shaped my childhood and shadowed my adulthood. No tears came this time, only calm. A deep, quiet calm that spread through me like warmth after a long winter. The flames reflected in my eyes as I whispered the words that rose from a part of me I hadn't known I still possessed. My body finally told the truth. And now I do too. The fire hissed as it burned through the last remnants. The smoke drifted upward, disappearing into a sky so wide it felt endless. For the first time in my life, I felt endless too. The past wasn't erased. It never could be. But it no longer dictated who I was. It no longer lived inside me disguised as weakness or imbalance or instability. I had faced it, exposed it, burned it, and in its place, something stronger rose the certainty that my life was finally irrevocably mine. I closed the lid of the empty box, placed it back under my arm, and walked toward the gate. I didn't look back. There was nothing left in that yard that belonged to me. My future waited beyond the fence, bright and untarnished, and for the first time, I felt ready to step into it fully. The promotion orders arrived on a quiet Wednesday morning, printed on crisp white paper, and slipped under my door at Southern Pines like any routine packet from Fort Liberty. But when I opened it and saw the words, Sergeant First Class Harper Lane, something inside me shifted. Not the startled disbelief I might have felt years ago. Not the anxious questioning of whether I deserved it. Just steadiness, pride, a kind of grounded certainty that came only from surviving what once tried to break me and walking forward anyway. When I reported to base that afternoon, Command Sergeant Major Fulton shook my hand with a warm firmness. "Lane," he said, "you've always been solid. But the way you've handled this past year, that's leadership most soldiers never learn. You earned this." I nodded, feeling no impulse to shrink, apologize, or deflect. I simply accepted the truth. I had earned it. The new assignment came shortly after training incoming female recruits, not just in physical readiness, but in personal boundaries, confidence, and recognizing early signs of coercive control inside and outside military life. "Your experience gives you perspective," Fulton said. "Not in a way that defines you, in a way that equips you." My first day with the recruits, I stood in front of them on the training field with the sun high and the air thick with the familiar smell of dust and determination. They were young, many of them barely 18, full of equal parts eagerness and fear, the way I once had been. I studied their faces and felt something warm settle in my chest. A purpose I never expected. "Here's what I'll teach you." I began, voice steady. Strength isn't just physical. It's knowing where you end and someone else begins. It's knowing that anyone who tries to shrink your world is not protecting you, they're limiting you. Out here, we build each other, not break each other. A few of them blinked hard, as if the words hit deeper than standard orientation. I saw pieces of myself in them, not the controlled version Earl crafted, but the person I had grown into despite him. After training each day, I returned to Southern Pines. Life there unfolded with a quiet rhythm I had never experienced before. Mornings began with sunlight warming the porch railing and the soft rustling of longleaf pines swaying in the breeze. I brewed coffee without rush, stretching into the day instead of bracing for it. My body felt normal again. Not monitored, not manipulated, not doubted. Just mine. My sleep remained steady. My pulse stayed calm. The hormone levels my doctors tracked reached healthy equilibrium. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night, startled by the memory of what it felt like to be constantly on alert, but it passed quickly, replaced by the realization that no one was watching me anymore. No footsteps in the hall. No voice evaluating my every move. No unseen hand shaping my choices. Silence was no longer a warning. It was peace. I kept running longer distances now, miles along the wooded trails, breath syncing with the rhythm of my steps. Yoga remained part of my routine, grounding me in balance and presence. And the veteran women's group became a small circle of belonging, a place where laughter came easily and stories flowed without judgment. Sometimes during our meetings, someone would talk about the past, about people who scaled their lives down to fit another person's control. Heads would nod, hands would tighten around coffee cups, and someone inevitably added, "We're not living like that anymore." Neither was I. My mother reached out occasionally, sometimes too cautiously, sometimes too often, always trying to understand where she fit now. I kept boundaries firm, but not cruel. Healing didn't mean reopening doors that needed to remain closed, but it did mean letting myself move forward without resentment eating away at the edges. As for Earl, he faded into the background of my life faster than I expected. The federal sentence ensured he would not be part of my world again. Not physically, not emotionally, not psychologically. The space he once consumed shrank into nothing more than a quiet chapter, a story of survival, not identity. On the first warm evening of June, I sat on my porch, watching the sky shift from gold to blue, to the soft lavender of early nightfall. Fireflies blinked in the yard. The world hummed with distant crickets. I breathed in deeply, feeling every inch of air move through a body that was finally unquestionably free. There were no strings attached, no scripts imposed, no shadows following me. Just the steady beat of my own heartbeat, my own rhythm, my own life. A life rebuilt not from the remnants of what had been controlled, but from the strength that had grown underneath it, waiting for the chance to rise. I closed my eyes, letting the breeze brush my face, and understood with absolute clarity I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living, and the future no longer frightened me. It finally felt like mine. If you've been listening to Harper's story and felt something tighten in your chest, something familiar, something you've never quite said out loud, this part is for you. Some people don't control with fists or threats. They do it quietly. They chip away at confidence. They monitor. They disguise ownership as concern. And sometimes it takes years before your own body wakes up and says enough. Has anyone ever tried to control your life quietly while calling it care? Have you ever escaped someone who insisted you needed them in order to function? Comment your city. I want to know how far stories like this travel and how many people out there have walked this same invisible road. And if you've ever broken free from someone who claimed they were helping you while tightening the cage around you, hear me clearly. You're not alone.